A very good evening to you. A warm welcome to Interface. My name is Thembi Samachele. Today we celebrate Press Freedom Day, and we do so by being joined by a veteran journalist and a man who's just been conferred with an honorary doctorate from the University of the Western Cape, Dr. Mathatha Tsedu, who is also the executive director of SANEF, which is the South African National Editors Forum. And he joins us today to reflect on the state of the media in South Africa. I know you've probably got thoughts on this, so do find us on our social media pages. On Facebook, it's at Interface on SABC, or on Twitter at Thembi Samachele or at Interface on SABC. Welcome and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Firstly, congratulations on the doctorate.
No, thanks.
And secondly, at a time in our country when the media has in itself been in the spotlight, your reflections on where we are as the media in 2016?
Well, the South African media is in a very good space, and that is actually the statement that SANEF issued on World Press Freedom Day on May 3rd. And we were saying that we look back into a space that was very difficult, that we passed, and then after 94 there were also some other difficulties that we had to contend with. But today, as we sit here, as an organization representing editors and media trainers and senior editorial executives, we are able to say that as the South African senior media executives, we feel that we are in a very good space where we are able to do the work that we need to do. But sometimes people don't understand that when you say something like that, they think you are now saying that there are no threats.
Everything is perfect.
Yeah, no, it isn't, and it never shall be, because governments will always be trying to push back the frontiers of media freedom. And for us, we have to stay at the barricades. But while we are standing there, we look around and we can see that we are actually in a very good space. There is still the state of the protection of state information bill that the president has been having on his desk for more than a year. He hasn't signed it. We have pleaded with him to send it to the Constitutional Court. But even that bill, as it sits there in front of him, has had more than 100 amendments made to it as a result of the representations that we made and other people also made. So we say we are in a good space, because even where there are attempts, when we stand up and make our voices heard, they are actually listened to.
On today's show, what we want to do is a combination of, saluting you in your personal capacity and your contributions to our democracy and to the South African media landscape.
Of that and just concentrate.
Thank you for being modest, but we'll do enough of that. But also reflecting on where we are and where we should be going as a very young democracy with a very vibrant media. But one of the statements that you made, I think it was a couple of months ago, was that every generation needs to tell the story of its time. Now, when you look at the story that we need to be telling today, which is the story of a burgeoning democracy, a young democracy that is trying to get somewhere, are we doing justice to that story as young journalists today?
Yeah, well, young and old, everybody who is in the field is doing great work. The measure of whether a profession like journalism in this instance is fulfilling its mission is whether those who use the services are actually in a space where they are able to do decisions about their lives. Now, in our case as journalists, our responsibility is to inform South Africans as truthfully as it is humanly possible, so that when they make their own decisions about their lives, it doesn't matter whether it's about the next local government elections or whether the story that is being said about one petrol being better than another. Our responsibility is to provide people with sufficient information so that they make important decisions about their lives from an informed position. And anyone who is a South African who is interested in any particular aspect of life is able to find either a radio station, a television channel, a newspaper, a magazine, some digital platform that will provide them with the kind of information that they need. And because South African media is able to do that, it is therefore fulfilling its mission as we stand here today.
But on that thought then, are we doing justice to the stories of the ordinary South Africans that are not maybe in the urban areas where most of the media houses are? I'm looking at people in villages across South Africa. Are we telling their stories, or are we perpetuating one narrative that is urban-based?
There are over 200 regional newspapers in the country. And at the last count, over 80 community radio stations. Those are stations, and now you have all these regional TV stations that have mushroomed, but they are only available on the satellite bouquets. But those community radio stations and those regional newspapers are mechanisms of telling the stories at that level. The mistake that we normally make sometimes is to think that because the Star or the Sowetan or the Citizen are based here in Johannesburg and we see them as some kind of national papers, therefore they must be able to take the story, the little story of what is happening in Mkanduli, and then put it in the newspaper here. It is not going to happen unless that Mkanduli story has morphed into a kind of national importance. But the fact that they are not being seen on this channel doesn't mean they are not being told somewhere by another medium.
But isn't it a disservice to the people of that Nkanduli, where a story that is very big to them is maybe not deemed to be of national importance by the editor of, I'm sorry, Mpumelelo, that we're picking on the Sowetan, of the Sowetan, let's say.
It doesn't even work there anymore.
Is he not there anymore? Okay, so the editor of the Sowetan or the City Press or the Sunday Times or whichever national newspaper, because they're not in touch with that story. So are we not then saying that the stories that happen in the regions will forever be important to the people there, but will not ever grow to where the power is?
No, it doesn't mean that, because if the story in Mkanduli is of such significance, whoever is the editor of the Sowetan today will pick that story up, because they will be seeing it in that Mkanduli publication that covers that area. It is not physically possible for SAFM to become the regional station that will tell all stories in Kanduli and Vuwani. Vuwani will make it into SAFM when it becomes what Vuwani has become.
Yeah. All right, we're going to have a short break. But remember that we are taking your thoughts, as always, on social media, so do find us there. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are celebrating the career of Dr. Mathatha Tsedu and also reflecting on International Press Freedom Day, and also taking your thoughts on what you think of the state of journalism in the country and whether or not your stories are being told and what more can be done to improve journalism in South Africa. Thank you very much for continuing to stay with us in Dr. Mathatha. So before the break, we're talking about the stories that are being told in the regions and whether or not we're doing justice to them. The other aspect of this is, are we, as people often criticize us as journalists, do we tend to blow out of proportion things that happen in government, or are we doing just what we are supposed to be doing in terms of our role as holding the state accountable?
That is a question that will never be resolved in any life space, because from where journalists and editors sit, a story is a story, and on any given day, whether that story is the front page story or it's not the front page story, it depends on the news menu of that day. So I know that people sometimes say they are tired of Nkandla, there must be other stories to tell, and other stories are also being told. But the reality is that when editors sit down and decide about what story they are going to flag as the main story, it depends on what they have on that day as at that time.
So let's reflect a little bit on your journey and moving from the times when you were selling newspapers on the streets to being, you know, the editor of publications like the Sunday Times and the City Press. When you look at the trajectory of the road that you've traveled, what would you say have been the main highlights that have made you say this is a life-changing, generation-changing moment from a media perspective? And are we having enough of those moments today?
Well, let's maybe just start by saying that when I started in 1978, which is centuries ago, the stories that we had to tell were completely different from the stories that today's generation has to contend with. We had to deal with the story of, which was almost formulaic, because you had a situation where you had this group of people who arrived here in 1652 and decided that we were nothing and they were going to lord over us, come what may. Right. And then you had us as the people who were being lorded over, uniting and trying to make sure that we are free. So the story that we then had to tell every day, for me, was to go out, find the facts that allow me to tell the story of the struggle that people are waging each day in trying to get us to the point of freedom. So I just needed to find it. The facts, every day I need to go out and find those facts and tell those stories, whether it's in the farms where people were being beaten up and they were standing up for their rights, or it's political activists who were being arrested and killed in jail. All of those fitted into that mode that said the story to tell. It's about the resistance that is underway. Now, today, the story of South Africa is a completely different story. It's a story of a country that is essentially free, that is transforming. And it's a very complicated story because whereas back then you could just talk about the ANC. Today when you say the ANC, somebody says, which ANC? Because the ANC is fracturing. When you look at the rest of the story that needs to be told, how are we as South Africans reintegrating ourselves into the community of nations of this continent that we are a part of?
Are we telling that story? Is that the narrative that you are seeing across the headlines? Or is the narrative, oh my goodness, things fall apart?
No, the story of the transforming South Africa is being told. And as it is being told, there is also a sense of, my God, things are actually falling apart. We are being ruled by a party that seems to have forgotten that it is part of a glorious history of a leadership that stood by principles that could be morally defensible at all times. It doesn't seem to worry the ANC anymore that those sort of things are no longer being associated with them.
If you're looking at the number of complaints that come before, you know, the press ombudsman, that come to SANEF, that come to any
BCCSA,
of the BCCSA, what do you make of that? Is that South Africans taking their rights and you know, exercising them, or are we making too many mistakes as the media and going for certain agendas that we are driving to the detriment of another?
If we take the press council, for example, most of the complaints that come before the press council are that the complainant, who was the subject of a particular story, was not asked for their comments. And that's the bulk of complaints.
But that's a basic journalism
Yeah,
rule.
it
And
is.
why are we still breaking that?
Nobody knows. And those, if you go through all the apologies that are being published, that's really the central point. The number of complaints can be seen in a negative way as indicating that things are not working. But there is also the reality that the Press Council has actually gone out of its way to publicize its work and to ensure that when newspapers make mistakes, those mistakes and corrections are not hidden on page 29,
Yeah.
but they are put in a particular space that is determined by the Press Council itself. So it has become much more visible, and people who otherwise would have just said, hey, these guys, again, I'm not even going to bother. Now take it seriously. Even the ANC, it's there. They are amongst them. The most complaints that are dealt with from political parties come from the ANC.
Okay, so we're going to take another short break, and after the break I want us to look at the transformation of the media and whether or not we are on the right track with that. And remember that if you'd like to take part in the conversation, you can do so by finding us on Facebook at Interface on SABC, or on Twitter at Tembisa Magele, or at Interface on SABC. To stay with us. Welcome back. You're still with Interface as we wrap up our discussion with Dr. Mathatha Tsedu, who is the Executive Director of SANEF, and taking your thoughts as well on social media, so do keep those coming. Let's talk about the transformation of the media. You know, the spotlight often gets turned on the media itself to say you're not being transformed, you are not having enough black-owned publications, you're not telling the stories of the majority of South Africans who are black. How transformed, in your view, is the media?
There's been some transformation, but not enough. Yeah. About 2.5 years ago, the print media established what was called the Print and Digital Media Transformation Task Team that looked at what level of transformation has happened and what needs to still happen. Those recommendations that were made by the PDM-TTT, the bulk of them have not been implemented.
By the media itself?
Yeah, by the print media.
Why?
I worked on that task team, and part of the recommendations was that, for just as an example, each company must establish a committee within that will check whether a number of areas are being transformed, and that information must be pooled and be given to the industry body called the Print and Digital Media South Africa. And that body would then collate all of that and present an industry picture. They rejected it and said they're not going to pull their information and give it to these people. They deal directly with the Department of Labor and DTI in terms of the scorecards. So all these other stories that they must do this and that, they are not interested in.
So
in
then
those
that brings to mind two things. If the media or the owners of the media are dragging their feet in terms of transformation, how can we trust them to be able to tell the stories of South Africa in a fair and balanced way? And secondly, if there is such a problem with transformation, what do we do about it?
Yeah, so let's take another example,
Yeah.
And say the gender issue. Board level, editors, senior managers, very bad. In one of the companies, the male component was 85%.
Sure.
So that's the picture that is out there. But when you talk now media as in content, the stories that are being told, when somebody starts a company and they say, I want to start the SABC, and they will determine who their target market is. They'll go and find somebody who will then be able to produce the content that speaks to that target market. So content, it's happening in terms of how things are covered. But when you look at the companies as companies that must themselves, as companies, meet all the legal parameters, transformation targets that have been set by government, the media companies are failing dismally.
Can the media then be trusted to self-regulate in an environment where the owners of such media are battling with a basic thing as transformation?
The regulation around the issues of content is at the moment self-regulatory, co-regulatory actually in terms of print because it's public members and media members who come together and form the press council. So that is working and if you take the press council as an institution and take it through all the tick boxes that need to happen in terms of transformation, gender, and all of that, you'll find that it meets its quotas. And in terms of the work that they are doing, it's marvelous. So there is a disjuncture between ownership and the changes that must happen there and the content that is being produced, which actually helps South Africans get better informed, even if the owners do not meet their own transformation
Should
targets.
Government become more involved in putting pressure on the owners to transform?
Government needs to insist that media companies, like any other company, should be able to meet the legal requirements of transformation.
Is it time for more stick and less carrot?
Yeah, insofar as that is concerned, I have no doubt that that is actually needed.
And then just in closing, as we look at the state of the media and looking at just your contributions over the years, now that you are Dr. Mathatha Tsedu, what do you think, in your wisdom, needs to be done to try and up the stakes when it comes to the way that we report, when it comes to the stories that we tell? Where are we lagging? Where should we improve?
As somebody who is very fanatical about my identity as an African person and our relationship with the rest of the continent, I think there isn't enough that is coming out of the continent into the psyche of South Africans, and media is failing in that respect. And that is primarily because most media houses rely on Western news agencies to cover Africa as a whole. And the agencies have their own missions back home. They are not going to be giving us everything that we ought to know.
Well, I hope that we improve in that. Congratulations once again, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
And that's where we leave it with Dr. Mathatha Tsedu. Remember that we can continue the conversation on our social media pages. Thank you so much for making the time to join us this week. Do join us again next week at the same time. From me, Thembisa Magele, and the team, good night.